At 3:14 a.m. on November 12, 2012, inside a 34-degree listening cabin in Aroostook County, lit only by a single amber desk lamp, a Hammarlund HQ-180 receiver with a visibly severed power cord began to hum softly against the damp silence. It spoke first. The air in the cabin was cold enough to hold my breath in faint, gray clouds that hung suspended in the dim light. On the corner of the pine desk, 3 inches from the receiver's heavy iron chassis, sat a lukewarm cup of dark coffee, its surface completely still, the dark liquid skinned over with frost. Underneath that mug lay a water-damaged 1998 frequency mapping chart for northern Maine, its paper soft, warped, and stained yellow from years of ambient moisture seeping through the cabin floorboards. I did not move. My eyes traced the path from the illuminated dial glass down to the rear chassis panel. The standard rubber power cord did not reach the wall. It lay limp on the damp subfloor, severed clean through 4 inches short of the outlet, its exposed copper core grayed by years of oxidation. When I ran the captured quarter-inch magnetic tape back across the playback head, the audio oscilloscope on my workbench displayed a flat line where ambient noise should have been. Every analog tape recording, even one made in an acoustic isolation chamber, leaves a thermal signature, a subtle, granular noise floor caused by the random orientation of magnetic iron oxide particles on the polyester backing. This 12-second segment had none. The 60 Hz electrical hum from the cabin lighting was missing. The baseline tape hiss, present on every roll of magnetic stock manufactured since the middle of the 20th century, was absolute zero. The voice did not ride on top of a physical medium, it was carved directly into the oxide. The alphanumeric code spoken by that cold speaker was not a standard municipal call sign or a federal radio regulation code. I stood up from the pine desk, my boots heavy against the cold floorboards, and walked over to the dark gray 4-drawer filing cabinet in the corner of the room. The steel frame was cold enough to sting my fingertips. I pulled open the 3rd drawer down, its heavy steel slides screeching softly in the damp, freezing air. Inside sat hundreds of hand-labeled expanding folders containing 10 years of cross-referenced police logs, Forest Service incident reports, and missing persons dossiers from across northern Aroostook County. My fingers stopped on a worn yellowed folder tab marked with black grease pencil, 09B. I pulled the file from the drawer and laid it flat under the single amber bulb on my desk. Inside lay 72 pages of official documentation detailing the unexplained disappearance of David Mercer. David had spent 8 years working alongside me cataloging unverified municipal records before he walked into the dense timber along Ridge Road on October 14, 2012, for a solo off-grid mapping survey. He carried a 70-pound pack, 3 days of emergency rations, and a portable high-frequency radio set. He never reached his second waypoint. When the Maine Warden Service drew search grids across the frozen granite ridges near the abandoned WKLN broadcast tower, they designated his operational search area as Sector 09B. They found no clothing, no discarded gear, and no footprints in the wet moss along the border cut. The search was suspended 14 days later when early winter snow buried the ridge. That private code existed in only 2 places, inside the sealed metal cabinet 3 feet behind my chair, and in the official warden logs locked in a state archive in Augusta. No distant pirate operator or local radio hobbyist could have known that designation. I booted up my secondary digital packet terminal, its monitor casting a pale blue wash over the damp pine desk, and queried the automated signal logs recorded by shortwave monitoring posts across northern Maine that night. Scroll after scroll showed empty spectrum data until the terminal flagged a single entry logged 40 miles to the west in Fort Kent by an amateur operator using the station handle K-1TGX. At precisely 3:14 a.m. on November 12th, his automated system had recorded an identical 12-second voltage spike on an unpowered antenna array, accompanied by a handwritten log note made at sunrise. There was no background hiss. There was no atmospheric static, no ionospheric crackle, and no distant bleed from commercial transmitters down in Bangor. The audio did not emerge from a baseline room noise, it simply occupied the cabinet with flat, unmodulated clarity. Then came the voice. It was measured, dry, and recorded with an unsettling spatial proximity, as though the speaker were sitting less than 6 inches from an open ribbon microphone inside an acoustic chamber. It pronounced 7 words: Vance, Julian, file 09B. I picked up my pen, a standard blue ballpoint with fading ink, and recorded the phrase directly onto the margin of my field logbook. The ink dragged across the paper, leaving thin, broken blue lines. I sat perfectly still in the freezing room, listening to the slow, rhythmic ticking of the cabin timber as the wood contracted under the midnight frost. The transmission lasted precisely 4 seconds. When it ceased, the receiver speaker returned to absolute dead silence. There was no residual capacitor bleed, no gradual fade, no electrical hum, only the damp cold and the heavy smell of stale coffee. Beside the Hammerlund sat a secondary battery-operated reel-to-reel deck, its mechanical counter still ticking slowly as the quarter-inch tape pulled across the magnetic head. I stopped the transport, unspooled the tape leader, and pulled the heavy gray binder containing regional radio allocations from the lower archive shelf. I began cross-referencing the exact frequency marker where the receiver's needle had rested, 91.3 MHz. The primary historical allocation for that specific band in Aroostook County belonged to a small regional broadcast relay operating under the call sign WKLN. According to the official database of the Federal Communications Commission, WKLN 91 N3 FM was formally declared bankrupt, its broadcast license revoked, and its transmitter site physically sealed in June of 2003. Its hilltop relay tower had been dead for 9 years. I pulled the microfilmed licensing records from the third cabinet drawer, laying the translucent acetate sheets flat over the illuminated glass of my desktop light box. The records for WKLN were unambiguous, typed on a manual ribbon typewriter that had left heavy, uneven ink deposits across the official municipal bond paper. The station had been constructed in the late autumn of 1984 as a non-commercial relay post, anchored to an isolated granite outcrop along Ridge Road, 3 miles north of the Canadian border cut. In June of 2003, following the sudden liquidation of its parent broadcast group, the operational license was formally surrendered to the federal government, leaving the physical infrastructure behind in the care of a court-appointed bankruptcy receiver who never once visited the property. According to the filed closure manifest, the station's technical plant had been dismantled with systemic finality. A field technician from Bangor had gone up the mountain on June 14th of that year to decommission the equipment. The primary high-power tetrode valve transmitters, specifically a pair of ceramic iMac 4CX25EB power tubes, were manually removed from their steel rack mounts, stripped of their high-voltage anode connectors, and placed into wooden crates for scrap liquidation. The utility feed running from the county road was severed at the pole. The heavy porcelain cutout fuses pulled by a line crew using a fiberglass hot stick at exactly 08:14 a.m. The steel tower was left standing in the weather, stripped of its broadcast bays, overgrown by black spruce and chokecherry brush that eventually swallowed the perimeter chain-link fence. Rare atmospheric ducting can occasionally carry radio signals across vast distances under specific thermal conditions, but even the most extreme ionospheric skip requires an energized source pushing current through a burning cathode. I stood up from the pine desk, stepping over the cold floorboards to inspect the physical antenna connection on the back of the Hammerlund receiver. A heavy length of braided RG8U coaxial cable extended from the rear SAE 0239 nickel-plated connector, disappearing through a rough hand-drilled hole in the edge of the wood workspace. I dropped to one knee, holding the amber desk lamp down toward the dark, damp crawl space beneath the furniture. The cable did not run out to an external long-wire array or a grounded outdoor antenna mast. It hung completely suspended in the cold air, severed clean through precisely 3 feet above the rotting hemlock subfloor. The physical condition of the wire proved it had been disconnected for years. The solid copper center conductor, exposed at the clean shear point, was no longer bright or metallic. It was coated in a thick, dull green verdigris, oxidized by the damp winter air that continuously seeped up through the foundation stones. The outer braided shield was flared outward like an unraveled wire rope, stiffened by rust, ambient grime, and decades of accumulated dust. The end of the wire was dry. Nothing touched it. Under standard electromagnetic theory, an open coaxial transmission line with an oxidized termination acts as a crude, highly inefficient capacitive stub, incapable of collecting meaningful signal energy from the ambient spectrum. To pick up an articulate voice transmission without an antenna, the surrounding radio frequency field would need to be so immensely powerful that it would induce measurable currents in every piece of scrap metal within a 5-mile radius. Yet my secondary monitoring gear, a battery-powered spectrum monitor sitting 6 inches away on the same shelf, showed a completely flat, quiet baseline across the entire VHF and UHF spectrum. I returned to the desk and opened a second manila folder, this one containing carbon copy power consumption logs subpoenaed from the Aroostook Valley Electric Cooperative following the 2003 regional grid consolidation. I cross-referenced the utility company's official termination reports with the blue ink log entry I had just written in my field journal. The utility company's records confirmed that power to the Ridge Road Transformer Bank was killed on June 14th. 203. No electrical current had touched the mountaintop in 3,439 consecutive days. I sat back in the wooden chair, the cold from the room settling deep into my shoulders. The silence in the cabin was dense, heavy, and absolute, broken only by the faint rhythmic scraping sound of the secondary reel-to-reel tape machine, continuing to turn on its aluminum spindles. The quarter-inch magnetic tape was still pulling slowly across the erase, record, and playback heads, capturing the ambient quiet of the room onto an oxide-coated polyester ribbon. I reached out and pressed the mechanical stop lever on the tape deck. The metal linkage clunked heavily into place, bringing the two plastic reels to an immediate halt. I flipped the toggle switch to rewind, watching the dark brown tape whir backward across the silver guideposts until the counter reset to 0. I plugged a pair of heavy rubber-sealed 600-ohm studio headphones directly into the deck's monitor jack, pulled the leather cushions tight against my ears, and engaged the playback drive. What was preserved on that magnetic surface was not an atmospheric signal, nor was it the artifact of a leaking commercial frequency. It was something far more precise, etched directly into the iron oxide without a single decibel of baseline hiss. I lifted the headphones off my ears and let them rest around my neck. The plastic foam was cold against my skin. On the desk beneath the amber light of the lamp, my field journal lay open, the faded blue ink of the entry standing out starkly against the yellowed graph paper. Vance Julian. File 09B. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the damp pine wood, staring at those 6 characters. That specific alphanumeric string was not a standard federal broadcast code, nor did it match any known FCC violation file format. It was a classification system I had devised myself, 3 years prior, to organize my personal archive of unverified regional missing persons records. I stood up, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight in the unheated cabin. Across the room stood a pair of 4-drawer industrial steel filing cabinets, painted dark gray, their metal surfaces cold to the touch and pitted with tiny flecks of rust along the bottom edges. These cabinets contained over 10 years of microfilmed police logs, local Forest Service incident reports, and newspaper clippings from across northern Aroostook County. I pulled open the 3rd drawer down. The heavy steel slides screeched softly in the freezing air, releasing the smell of aging paper, damp cardboard, and oxidized graphite. My fingers moved past the tabbed manila folders, skipping the historical land grant disputes and the 1980s grid anomaly logs until they settled on a thick, expanding file jacket labeled with a strip of white masking tape. Written on that tape in black permanent marker was the code 09B. I pulled the folder from the drawer, carried it back to the desk under the single bulb, and laid it flat next to the running tape deck. File 09B contained the complete documentation surrounding the disappearance of David Mercer. David had been my closest research associate during our years cataloging municipal radio archives in Bangor, a man whose methodical nature matched my own. On October 14, 2012, 29 days before the Hammarlund receiver spoke, David had walked into the dense timber along the international border cut near Ridge Road for an off-grid topographic survey. He carried a 70-pound pack, a 3-day supply of provisions, and a portable high-frequency transceiver. He never checked in at his designated rendezvous 0.3 miles down the ridge. When the Maine Warden Service launched their search 48 hours later, they designated the primary operational search quadrant around the abandoned WKLN broadcast tower as Sector 09B. Inside this manila folder were the handwritten search logs, the high-resolution topographic maps marked with red grease pencil grids, and the final inconclusive incident report signed by the game warden in charge. No clothing was recovered, no footprints were identified in the damp peat along the granite ridge. His portable transceiver was never keyed on any emergency frequency. The case was officially suspended on October 28 due to early winter snowfall, leaving behind nothing but 72 pages of dead paperwork in my cabinet drawer. I sat back down in the pine chair, feeling the cold air settle deep into the small of my back. The voice that had emerged from an unpowered receiver with a severed copper cord at 3:14 a.m. had not pulled a random string of numbers from the spectrum. It had spoken my name, and it had cited a private file code that existed in only 2 places on Earth, inside the closed steel drawer 3 feet behind me, and inside my own personal notes. No external broadcast operator, no amateur radio enthusiast. and no distant pirate station could have known that designation. It was not public information. It was an isolate. I pulled a secondary logging terminal from the side shelf, waiting for the screen to cast a pale blue glow over the dark workspace. I logged into the Regional Packet Radio Bulletin Network, a localized offline digital log repository maintained by a network of shortwave operators across northern New England who mirrored their station logs via automated VHF packet nodes. I ran a query for all unmodulated audio spikes recorded on 91.3 MHz between 3 and 4 in the morning on November 12th. I expected nothing. The cabin in Aroostook County was isolated, surrounded by miles of thick timber and granite hills. But as the terminal window scrolled, a single record appeared at the top of the screen. 40 miles to the west, in an isolated farmstead outside Fort Kent, an amateur operator designated K-1TGX had logged an automated signal capture on 91.3 MHz. The timestamp on his digital log reader matched mine down to the exact second. 3:14 a.m. His automated receiver had registered a sharp 12-second voltage spike on an unpowered antenna array, accompanied by a single handwritten operator note added at dawn. Signal localized to internal circuit resonance. Voice output verified. Audio contents redacted. The entry on the screen from operator K1TGX sat fixed in the cold blue light of the terminal, 40 miles removed across the dark spruce canopy of the Canadian border. Signal localized to internal circuit resonance. It was the same technical phrasing an engineer uses when a high-voltage surge skips an antenna entirely and vibrates directly through the steel chassis of an instrument. I turned away from the terminal, my shadow stretching long across the floorboards, and pulled the amber desk lamp closer to the dark metal frame of the Hammarlund HQ 180. I unscrewed the 4 rear retaining bolts on the receiver steel cabinet, the cold metal threads resisting slightly before giving way with a dry metallic snap. Lifting the heavy top panel away revealed the internal chassis frozen in 34-degree air. Inside, 12 vacuum tubes sat seated in their porcelain sockets like small hollow glass monuments. Their cathode filaments were cold, translucent, and dark, completely free of any internal glow or heat shimmer. Surrounding them, the copper transformer windings were dull, encased in decades of hardened varnish, completely isolated from any external power source. The metallic structure had suffered direct mechanical induction. The voice had not been received. It had been induced. The physical components inside the unpowered steel casing, the delicate grid wires inside the glass envelopes, the iron cores of the audio output transformers, the very chassis plate itself had physically vibrated in response to a localized magnetic stress. The metal had acted as its own transducer. The Hammarlund had not tuned to a frequency on 91.3 MHz. Its cold circuitry had simply been forced to resonate, mechanically mimicking the acoustic signature of a human voice speaking 6 inches from a microphone. I placed my hand against the cold iron frame of the receiver. The metal was inert. On the pine desk beside the radio, the field logbook remained open to the page where my blue ballpoint pen had recorded those 7 words. Vance, Julian, file 09B. The ink was dry, the broken lines of the ballpoint pigment pressed deep into the fibers of the paper. Next to the logbook rested the aluminum tape reel from the secondary recorder. The 12-second segment preserved on that quarter-inch brown polyester ribbon contained no thermal noise, no tube rush, and no static floor. When an unpowered circuit vibrates physically without a carrier wave, there is no signal-to-noise ratio to calculate. There is only absolute silence, interrupted by the precise acoustic print of a voice that knows your name. I did not attempt to re-energize the set. I did not splice the severed copper cord or plug the rubber lead back into the wall outlet. To force electrical current into a circuit that has already spoken without it is to invite a different kind of failure. I unspooled the recorded quarter-inch tape from the deck, placed it carefully into a heavy plastic protective sleeve, and walked back across the groaning floorboards to the gray steel filing cabinets in the corner of the room. I slipped the tape sleeve directly into the expanding manila folder alongside the search logs, the red-line topographic maps, and the inconclusive incident reports from Sector 09B. David Mercer's file was complete now, though no warden had signed off on its final page. We often looked to the sky for anomalies, searching for atmospheric skips, solar flares, or unmapped transmitters hiding in the blank spaces of the frequency spectrum. We assume that every signal requires an origin, a power grid, and a burning cathode pushing electrons through a vacuum. But sometimes the spectrum is entirely silent. Sometimes a dead receiver on a damp desk in Aroostook County does not pick up a broadcast from 9 years in the past. It simply vibrates because something in the room, or in the woods beyond the border cut, decided to speak directly to the iron inside the machine. The physical tape remains in drawer 09, untouched since that cold November night. The receiver on my desk is silent now, its copper wire dry, its tubes long dark. Leave your light on, review your own recordings, and join me next time when we unseal the 1994 grid failures of Piscataqui County. I am Julian Vance. Good night.